In our last video, we saw how modern biology, especially evolutionary biology, tends not necessarily jump to conclusions, but at least it extrapolates to conclusions. It is what I like to call the extrapolation syndrome. That is, we start from a truth, an effect, and generalize it. That is, we discover a fact and test it and see through observation and experiments that this fact is true, and that's what we call a scientific fact. But then we tend to use it to explain all of reality. We tend to generalize these elementary basic truths as having an explanatory power that can be expanded to all there is, while in reality this single fact does not have that kind of explanatory power. In our case, I made the example of Darwinian mechanisms of evolution, such as natural selection, random mutation, genetic variation, adaptation, epigenetics, etc., and showed that while these single evolutionary mechanisms are true and explain some processes of life, the idea that these can be extrapolated and can be used to explain all evolution in all its aspects is a much too optimistic hypothesis. It is just a conjecture, a pretty much wild speculation, I would say, and in any case certainly not a scientific established fact. Because after all, with these principles one can explain everything and even its opposite. These single true facts, such as mechanisms of Darwinian evolution, that however then are extrapolated to all of reality, create an appealing illusion of knowledge with which we can seemingly explain whatever we want. This doesn't mean that there might be some new principles that can explain also evolution better than what we can do today. The fact is that I believe that we will sooner or later have to accept to look at life and the world also from a first-person perspective, from a more psychological point of view, and finally also from a more metaphysical point of view. While when we continue to look at the world only from the third-person perspective, looking at it only as a mechanism, we will see always only a mechanism, and thereby always there will remain a deep mystery that we can't explain. Here I would point out a similar unaware conclusion we have about biology and life in general. First of all, I think that the question of what biology is must be discerned from the question of what life is. Biology is a study of life, but this does not answer the question of what life is. One thing is the study of the external functions of some material, bioelectrical, biochemical, physical machinery. And then another is to know what the internal forces are that drive that machinery. So the question, what is life, is a question old as the ancient Greek philosophers. Aristotle and Plato asked if there is a difference between a rock and organisms like us. Erwin Schrödinger, the famous Austrian physicist of the last century, wrote also a famous booklet entitled What is Life? Also Nobel Prize winning French philosopher Henri Bergson pondered on the creative evolution, that is, the creative aspect of life. The real problem that they all encountered is that biology is material science that studies the external aspects and processes of life and of organisms, that, however, abstracts from the internal dimension of the living being, processes Seen from a purely bodily perspective, such as maintaining equilibrium through homeostasis, genetic variation, change, natural selection, random mutations, adaptations, morphological diversity, for example, complexity, reproduction, etc., are all aspects of life, external aspects of life, but don't neither explain what real life is and whether there is a real difference between living and dead matter to begin with, nor does it tell us much about why living organisms are also endowed with inner qualitative processes that we call desires, emotions, feelings, instincts, intentionality, will, and creativity. I think it is a mistake of modern science to consider evolution as a process driven solely by external forces and physical traits. For example, the environment, genetics, chemistry, physics. Evolution does not depend only on an external to internal flow and direction of movement. That is, only on the blind mechanistic response of the organism due to the impact of the environment. But it also depends from an inside-out direction and flow. Organisms also respond themselves to the environment because of an inner psychological force. We are goal-driven organisms. We have desires. We have inner feelings, imaginations, will, and an intention that drives us from the inside and thereby acting on the outside world. The whole internal dimension that has driven evolution through the eons has been ignored in biology, or was at best considered as a secondary propulsive force. While it might well be the opposite, these internal psychological forces might have and certainly have in the human being a primary function and impact on the evolutionary destiny of the species. In fact, that can be observed not only in humans or higher primates, but in all the animal and living kingdom. There is in fact now sufficient scientific evidence how all the way down to single cellular organisms, also single cells, have a so-called basal cognition. There is, we know now that this is the fact as well, that even single cells have some elementary form of associative learning skills and, who knows, perhaps also sort of basal sentience. For some mysterious reason, life evolves not only external morphological traits but expresses sentience, consciousness, volition, aim, purpose, will, and a whole set of psychological, or if you prefer to call it more elementary or proto-psychological traits already from the first protozoa. In what sense do the Darwinian processes, such as natural selection, random mutation, etc., or the above characterizations and definitions of life, self-organizing, system in equilibrium, interaction, change, etc., explain the emergence of these internal desire forces, will forces, creative forces, or just life forces? And what is consciousness? Why did mind emerge? Why should a whatever complex system, whatever nonlinear, autopoietic, adaptive, self-referential, super hyper complicated, whatever you wish, name it, why should this complex system become sentient in the first place? There is no apparent reason from a purely third-person perspective and scientific perspective. Why does life behave like a sentient, goal-driven and willing entity if it is supposed to be an emergent epiphenomenon that can be reduced to a sum of insentient, goalless and unconscious building blocks and phenomena? Wherefrom does will, aim, cognition, motivations, and purposeful behavior come from? Why aren't we insentient and emotionless organisms without feelings, emotions, consciousness? Biology, neuroscience, and Darwinian evolution do not give any answer to these aspects of life. On the contrary, feelings, consciousness, mind are all aspects that they would resolutely deny to exist, would it not be for our subjective personal experience that tells us otherwise. But speaking of evolutionary advantages, more or less selfish genes, or natural selections, nonlinear self-organization of complex systems, etc., does not even begin to try to answer these questions. So there remains a huge missing link that biology, neuroscience, and Darwinian evolution do not even address. In this sense, one can say that biology is the study of life, but at least when it comes to these more philosophical and foundational questions, it doesn't even begin with explaining what life is and where this qualitative and experiential dimension of life emerges from. Whereas I believe that when science will begin to take seriously also this first-person perspective and will change its way of seeing the world, going beyond a purely one-sided, third-person, materialistic, reductionist perspective to a more complementary, encompassing, inner, first-person perspective, only then will we be able to shed light on the true nature and meaning of life.